spirituality would say, look inside, go on an inner journey and find out what's happening inside. Because when you can do this, then you'll be able to identify various things that you wouldn't have been able to acknowledge if you were just looking at things from an external level. But when you go on an inner journey, then the whole game of blaming and complaining comes to a standstill. Because then it's me and what's going on in my own inner world. I'm glad that young men are agreeing. Nice to see young men especially, and young women, but especially young men at a gathering like this. So, when I begin with myself, then I see, how could I have done things differently? Maybe that's the first question to ask. Not even, how could I have done things better? No, just differently. It's a question that allows you to explore what the external situation was and what your response to that situation happened. And then, having seen what happened, then this question allows you to have a 360 view of it. You're looking at it from different perspectives, not blaming yourself, not complaining about yourself, I should have, I shouldn't have, no. But just, were there factors that allowed the possibility of a different input than I was able to give at that time? Things happen quickly, and so totally understandable that whatever happened as a sort of instant reaction. But when I start going on this inner journey, I stop reacting. That doesn't mean I become passive. It means that I take a moment to step back, and because I've been through this exercise of looking at the same situation from a total, all-round perspective, I've been able to notice certain things that could have been a bit different. And so now when I'm in a similar situation, or maybe a different situation, but I can use the same formula. But I can only use it if I stop reacting. Reaction is part of our evolutionary process. When we were fighting tigers and lions in the jungles, at that time you didn't have time to process. You either just started running or you started fighting. The fight or flee mechanism. And so to a certain extent it's still inbuilt within us. But I don't have to allow myself to be controlled by that instinct, which is not using it in a bad way, but animal instinct. But I still have to face them. But neither am I going to fight them, nor am I going to run away from them. That wouldn't be appropriate. But that instinct of immediate reaction, that doesn't have to happen anymore. I can take a moment to step back and pause, and instead of my usual reaction, now that I've been through this process of looking at things from an all-round perspective, and it doesn't take a long time. It takes a long time to put it into words. But if I begin to develop this practice, it's actually something that happens quite smoothly, quite fast. You know, they say that before you say anything to somebody, count 10. And never mind counting 10, even if I were to count 5, it would help. We usually never bother to count 10 anyway. And then when we don't count 10, afterwards I wish I could have bitten off my tongue because I said things in haste that I didn't really intend to. And maybe even spending a couple of hours trying to pacify that person still isn't working, and might be weeks and months before things return to normal. Somebody told me, and I think it's more or less accurate, if I explode with anger, or maybe not a full explosion, maybe a little bit of anger, the other individual doesn't forget it for at least 6 months. Is that your experience? More or less 6 months before things get maybe a year, depending on the intensity of the explosion. And maybe even never. Sometimes people don't forget ever if they've been hurt really hard, because the wound is so deep that it never goes away. It leaves a scar. Maybe even the wound heals, but there's a scar that's left behind. And so very important. If you can't see me, just make a window for yourself. Just adjust your chairs. If you move your chairs a little bit, I know, the other way. Try moving the other way, just a little bit. Because I know one of you was going to get a pain in their neck if they were craning their neck. Better? And there at the back, there's seats in the front. They're not reserved. You can come and take them. So, that pause can be very, very beneficial. It'll save me a lot of time and energy later on if I give myself that possibility. And so non-reaction means that I choose how to respond. I was mentioning earlier that we haven't fully understood responsibility. And people say, I'm responsible for this thing, for that thing and the other thing. But it feels like a burden that's making them heavy. But responsibility is the ability to respond in an appropriate manner. Here's a task I have to do. Yes, I'm responsible, but that doesn't mean I have to take any pressure. Pressure doesn't necessarily have to be part of it. Being responsible means, yes, I'm going to give it my focus, my attention, but I'm going to do it with love. And so the love takes away the pressure. And so love in different forms, but definitely in terms of being able to fulfill responsibility. Whether it's a child with a sense of responsibility to be obedient to the parents, or whether it's parents who feel responsibility for the child. And of course, both are responsible in their own different ways. But fill that with love, and the child being responsible to the parents for their obedience, and they're doing it out of love. Beautiful. And it's a lovely relationship of respect. The parents fulfilling their responsibility with love, and it means that love is not cloying, is not one that's going to limit the growth of the child. When there's possessiveness, then it's restricting and it doesn't allow for full growth. And so responsibility, treating the child with love and respect. And that means then that there's going to be positive growth in all directions. growth for the parents and growth for the child. So the ability to respond is different to the reactions, and the change happens when I take that moment to pause, and then I can see what it is my options are very quickly, and seeing my options, then I say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. Not only this is what I'm going to say, this is how I'm going to say it. We don't always remember the words that were spoken, but we remember the tone with which something was said. And maybe it's a very simple request to get something for me, but a tone of humility, and the response from the other individual will be a sweet one. A tone of bossiness, just about picking up something and getting it, but a tone of bossiness comes across, and there's ego there, and there's a reaction. Well, they can go get it themselves. Why are they asking me? So not so much the words, but the tone expresses the consciousness with which I'm saying something. And so the positive response is, yeah, what am I going to say or do? But also the attitude behind what I say and do. The tone of voice is not something that you can consciously control and say, okay, I'm going to have a tone of humility. Not so easy. But more, it's the change of attitude, the change of awareness, the change of consciousness. Tone is due to the vocal cords, and so trying to adjust those. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to manipulate my vocal cords. But what I do know is my consciousness and my attitude are something that I can actually manage. So human relationships are what the world is all about, and human relationships can either be ones that bring happiness and love, and human relationships can be those that give maximum pain and sorrow, and they can go in either direction. But generally speaking, for the last little while, they've been going more in the area of negativity rather than positive experiences. And I decide to look at what's going on in my own inner world. Then I'll know what to do outside also. And what's going on in my own inner world is something that I probably don't know anything about, or very little about. The reason being, I haven't given time to look at my inner world. Somebody gives you a magazine and a week later says, can you return this magazine? You must have looked at it and finished with it. And you say, oh my goodness, I forgot. I didn't look at it. I didn't make time for it. Well, okay, that's something external, and even if you didn't, no big deal. The information that's important is going to come to you in some form or another. But nobody reminds us to look at what's going on in our inner world. And it's not just a week that has passed by, it's years and years and years that have passed by. Somebody said yesterday, she's actually a teacher, and it was in a big forum with I think 1,800 people, and she had the courage to speak up on the mic and when it was question time, and she said, I talk to myself and people think I'm crazy. And my response to her was, no, it's absolutely the right track. talking to yourself, the dialogue with yourself is the way to get to know yourself. And then somebody mentioned later a very sweet comment about it, that they were with some medical people and they said that if you're talking to yourself and you don't realize you're talking to yourself, you've got a problem. But if you're talking to yourself and you know you're talking to yourself, then that's not an issue. And I would say that the talking to yourself is best done quietly, in silence, inside. A, because then it doesn't cause anyone worry, but also B, you're more likely to be really honest in your dialogue with yourself if it's a silent conversation inside. No fear of anyone overhearing and having a peep into your inner world. Why should they? It's sacred, it's for me to look at, not for somebody else. And so, going inside and talking to myself will help me understand what's going on inside. And the more I know, the more I'm able to shift things around in a positive direction, and the more I'm then able to love myself. I'll give you an example. It all sounds very abstract, but a practical example. Just taking up the example of love. One of the reasons why we don't love ourselves so much is because there's a difference between our own inner core values, which we believe are important, and the way in which we're behaving. Okay, I'll explain it more. What do you feel if there's a day when you've been kind to somebody? How do you feel when you've been kind? You feel happy. You're happy with yourself. That person, whether they've appreciated it or not, well, they've gone their way and they're doing what they need to do. But the feeling it's left inside of you is that, yeah, I did the right thing at that moment. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't just thinking about me, but I did what was needed, or I understood was needed at that time. This is because when I do something that's close to my core value of goodness, and kindness is very close, I'm feeling the feedback of that, contentment, happiness. And if there's a day in which you've been cruel to somebody, and maybe that's too strong a word, maybe there's been a day in which you've been a bit unkind in your comments to somebody. At that moment you said it, but a bit later on there's something that keeps knocking in your head and you feel that it wasn't quite right and you're not so happy with yourself that day, correct? And so when I do something that is close to my inner core values of peace, of love, of truth, of joy, of cleanliness, purity, things are clean inside, and it's expressed in my actions, I'm content with myself, I'm happy with myself, and I can love myself. When I've done or said things that are contrary to this, I'm not so happy, I'm not so comfortable, and I can't love myself. And so one of the big reasons why we don't really know how to love ourselves is because there's this gap between who I really am and the things that I'm saying and doing. And usually I don't realize this, and so I carry on. And it might even come to the point where I don't like myself at all. And then this gets expressed as either inferiority or superiority complex. I need to prove how great I am, and so I act as if I'm head above everyone else. Or sometimes I really feel very put down and inferior, and they're actually two sides of the same coin. They're just simply an indication that I don't know what's going on. And spending a little bit of time, even I would say not at the end of the day, but if I've had a meeting with somebody, I've been with a group of people, then usually there's even maybe a moment or two between one thing finishing and going on to the next, usually. And what we usually do now when we finish one thing and before we go on to the next, in that little space, we pull out our mobile devices and have a look. Oh, I wonder what are the messages that have come. And so we occupy our minds with external stuff again. If I were to say more important than the messages that are coming to me, I can deal with them later. And people know that I'm occupied through the day. They won't mind if they get a response later on. It doesn't have to be instant. If I do give an instant response, they'll give me another message and expect me to respond instantly again. And so the back and forth can't carry on. It's too much time that's going in that, and instead of being in the present where I am, I'm somewhere else. And so it's important to stay present. And if instead of looking at things like that, or just calling somebody at that moment, but walking from one room to the other room, walking from one place to the other place, if in those moments I use my time to process what's going on, the 360 degrees that I mentioned, I said this and did this, but could I have done it differently? And that immediate processing is extremely valuable, because that's when you're able to see things very clearly, very honestly. Your feelings are still very much there. Your observations are still very clear. An hour later, other things have taken over, and what happened in that time that I had with so-and-so an hour ago? But in that 1 hour, many other things have happened. All the other images and voices have come in. And so I'm not as clear about the situation as after it happened immediately. I can bet you, if when you leave this room today, as you're walking to the bus stop, walking to the car, walking wherever, if you just take a few moments to just register for yourself and process what it is that happened in this space, in this event, your evaluation of that will be quite different to if you wait till the end of the day. And if you say at the end of the day, well, I'm so exhausted, I just want to sleep, fine. And then if you try and process it tomorrow or a couple of days later, 80% of it will have been lost. We just can't hold so much information in ourselves all the time. But the processing means that I'm extracting what is useful and keeping that. And so keeping an hour and a half's worth stuff is different to process, extract 2, 3 points. And yes, I can record 2 or 3 points very clearly. And that will stay with me, not just till tomorrow, but for as long as I want to. And so, big difference between immediate processing and later on that day, or the next day, or the next day. Literally. And so, learning to love starts with learning to love myself and understanding that this coordination, synchronicity of my own inner values and the values that I mentioned as the starting point are the values that are there in every single human being, no exception.